Ryan Busse, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Trevor. It's fantastic to be here.
You've written a book that I think threads the needle in a very complicated conversation that America is having. And that conversation is, what are guns? What do guns mean to America? And is there anything that can be done to try and reduce gun violence in the country? And just so people have an understanding of who you are, I mean, you're like the poster child for the NRA. I mean, you were gifted shotguns as a kid, right? You were an avid hunter. You were an avid defender. You still are of the Second Amendment. You worked as for a gun manufacturer for 25 years, and yet you say that there is a lot that is wrong with the gun industry. Let's talk about that. What changed in your life? What was the moment where you thought, this is not going the way it should?
I think there's a few things that changed more than anything. I think the gun industry and the NRA changed around all of us. And I think democracy, there's a lot of freedoms in America which are beautiful. The right to self-defense and to own guns and to do things that I love to do with my boys and to shoot and to hunt and all of those things is fantastic. But if it's not balanced with responsibility, it's going to run out of control. And I started to see things in the firearms industry and in my life and in my career where responsibility was not being inserted into the discussion anymore, and just runaway rights were taking over. And in the early 1990s and in the 2000s, when I got into the industry, it was a much different place where responsibility and decency were still inserted into the argument, and they're no longer there anymore. It's a very frightening place we live in now.
It's interesting you say that because, when I was reading the book, there were so many things I didn't know about the journey of the NRA. I didn't know about the journey of guns in America. I've read about it, but as somebody, as an insider, you really give an insight into a world that I think a lot of people don't know much about. For instance, I didn't realize that at some point the NRA essentially became more powerful than the manufacturers of guns themselves. You talk about a moment where Smith & Wesson decided to stand up and say, actually, maybe we could do more for gun safety, and the NRA led a boycott against them.
Yeah, I think it's important to note, I often hear on reports and NPR segments where people say, well, the NRA is just a tool of firearms manufacturers. I found that to be exactly the opposite. The NRA ran the show. They still ran the show. They set the narrative. Everything that they stated, every tactic that they laid down, everybody said, yes, sir, can I have another? My experience is there's no separation between the NRA and the firearms industry, because there's an intertwined sort of symbiosis between what drives success for the NRA, which is fear, conspiracy theory, hatred of the other, acceptance of racism. Those things drive electoral outcomes, and the NRA stumbled onto that 15 or 18 years ago. Those are exactly the same things that drive firearm sales. And so there's a very unhealthy symbiosis between those two entities.
Yeah, one of the parts of the book that really stuck with me was when you were talking about yourself as a gun owner and you're talking about your sons and your family. And you said something really interesting that I think a lot of people don't actually think about. And you said, we don't identify with guns. We like using them, we like hunting with them, we like shooting with them, but we don't identify ourselves with the firearms. What did that mean, and why is that important?
Well, I think there's a couple different types of flags that we saw on January 6th. We saw Trump and American flags, and then we saw the other type of flag we saw were come and take it AR-15 flags. Political radicals, right-wing political radicals in this country now are driven, are owned. They use guns as the central symbol of their identity. It's a dangerous thing. This is authoritarianism, at its formative stages. There are millions of responsible gun owners in this country who love to shoot with their kids and hunt and do all the things that I love to do, and believe in the right to self-defense. But this idea that guns are somehow the symbol of some right-wing political movement, that's dangerous 1936 Germany stuff. It's frightening.
So do you think there's a world then where America can find a balance between owning guns and still living in a safer society? And I asked this question because, here on the show, we've done a piece on Switzerland and how Switzerland, I think, has more guns per capita than the US and yet has lower gun deaths than the US, because the Swiss say they teach people to respect the weapons. They teach people, how to hold the weapons, play with the weapons, use the weapons in the right environments. Even kids are taught how to shoot in some of the schools. And it feels like there's a culture around the gun. But what I found interesting again in the book is you talk about how that culture used to exist, and then it started getting mocked. Like you talk about the FUDs, as they call them, the Elmer FUDs, with the gun safety guys. Like, it seems like it's not cool to be safe with guns now in the world of gun ownership.
Well, that sort of responsible activity slows down the desired outcome. It's not cool to be responsible in our politics anymore. If you haven't noticed, all of these social norms that once existed, where you didn't say certain things, you didn't tweet death threats to members of Congress.
Right.
These norms were not broken. That's the same thing happened in the firearms industry 15, 18 years ago. These norms of self-control, responsibility, decency, and I mean, to your point about like, what is the way out of this? Well, America is a democracy that operates in the gray spaces. It's a beautiful thing, but it only exists because of norms and imposed self-responsibility. And gun owners for a long time were a poster child for that sort of responsibility. I tell stories in the book about how the firearms industry 15 or 18 years ago would not allow tactical anything to be displayed in its own trade show. Gloves, tactical vests, AR-15s, high-cap magazines, those were not displayed in its own trade show.
And why was that?
Because the firearms industry imposed these rules upon itself, upon ourselves. We knew that this was a bad thing to infiltrate society with.
So that was sort of like a fringe idea of what owning a gun was about.
And we knew that that was a dangerous thing.
Right.
That meant that we accepted a certain level of sales and that we wouldn't infiltrate guns, proliferated guns, and lack of decency throughout society. But you have to accept that sort of self-restraint. That sort of self-restraint is now gone. And the same exact thing is happening in our politics, right? Like the sorts of things that we once knew not to say, not to do, not to call your relative, not to call your coworker, not to say in polite society. That's all gone. The NRA and the gun industry perfected that.
When we talk about some of the policies, what do you look at? I know one of the proposals right now that seems to have support from the right and the left is people saying, hey, let's go after those dealers who are selling guns to people, and they know that it's going straight to the black market. Let's go after those dealers. Are you for legislation like that? And what other policies do you think America could actually implement where people would see a change in gun violence?
I'm in favor of two things right now. One, we need to close the gun show loophole. We've been trying to do this since before Columbine. The kids in Columbine used guns that were purchased through the gun show loophole. 20-some years later, we still haven't closed it. It's a simple thing. It's unforgivable. We should do it. It's not going to be perfect. It's going to fix some things. It's going to mitigate some things. That needs to be done. Secondarily, I'm worried about the larger societal impacts and the graph of where gun radicalization and right-wing radicalization is taking our country. I don't think Kyle Rittenhouse was an aberration. I think he's a warning of what's to come. We need to outlaw as a country, state by state, county by county, or hopefully as a nation, open armed intimidation. You can't have open civil society. You can't have democracy when one party is standing over the other with a loaded AR-15. That's not civil. So I believe two things would help now. Close the gun show loophole and legislation to outlaw armed intimidation and open carry.
Well, you've written a really compelling book. I know there'll be people who will be for it, people who will be against it, but that's what arguments are for. Thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thanks, Trevor.
Appreciate having you here. All right, Gunfight is available wherever books are sold.